In the ancient land of Egypt, a land of golden sands and stone horizons, death was never treated like an ending. It was treated like a crossing. When the last breath left the body, the Egyptians believed something still remained, something that could travel and speak and remember. And the world beyond was not empty. It was a realm of gates and rivers, of hidden names and watchful beings, of laws older than kings. A realm the Egyptians called the Duat, a night world where the soul could be tested, protected, or lost. That is why there existed a collection of words so carefully chosen, so deliberately placed, that they were laid beside the dead like a compass. Today we call it the Book of the Dead. But it was never a book meant to worship death. It was a guide meant to defeat confusion, a map made of spells, so a soul could find its way back into light. The first secret is simple. The Book of the Dead was not one book. It was a collection, a gathered body of spells and declarations, copied by scribes onto papyrus, assembled in different ways for different people. Some scrolls were long and lavish, crowded with ink and painted scenes. Some were brief, containing only the most essential passages. Because death in the Egyptian imagination wasn't a single step, it was a journey with many possible dangers. So you didn't need every spell ever written. You needed the spells that mattered to you, your name, your protection, your passage. And the most important thing these spells offered wasn't comfort. It was authority. The authority to stand in the next world and say clearly, I know this gate. I know this name. I have the right to pass. To modern eyes, a tomb looks like a final resting place. To ancient Egypt, it was more like a harbor, a sealed chamber where the body was preserved and where offerings could be made so the dead would not be abandoned. But the soul was not meant to remain trapped in stone. The dead were meant to move, to rise, to come forth by day. That phrase, come forth by day, was a promise that the darkness of the tomb was not the end of the story, only the beginning of a route. And routes can be lost. So families prepared as if preparing a traveler. They gathered linen, oils, amulets, offerings of bread and beer. They hired artisans to carve, to paint, to inscribe. They paid scribes to copy the right words with steady hands. Black ink for the body of the spell, red ink for the lines that mattered most. In lamplight, papyrus was unrolled like a river made of fiber. A reed pen whispered across it. Pigments, malachite green, ochre gold, carbon black, were ground into paste, and slowly the afterlife became visible, not as a dream, but as a set of instructions. Because the Egyptians did not rely on hope alone. They relied on preparation. They believed the next world listened, and if it listened, then words, precise words, could become a kind of armor. A tomb held the body, but the Book of the Dead was meant for the part that walked away. And that brings us to the heart of Egyptian funerary magic, the soul itself. The Egyptian soul was not imagined as a single, simple thing. It was layered, like a lamp made of many flames. There was the Ka, the life force, the vitality that needed nourishment. Offerings mattered because the Ka mattered. There was the Ba, the personality, the moving essence that could travel. In art, it could appear as a human-headed bird because the Ba was the self that could move between worlds, leaving the tomb, returning again. And there was the Ak, the effective spirit, the transformed state, shining, enduring, no longer fragile. The Ak was not automatic. It was achieved because the pieces had to remain intact. The name had to be preserved. Identity had to hold. The Ba had to return. The Ka had to be sustained. And the Ak had to be formed, like a star condensing out of mist. This is why names appear everywhere in Egyptian funerary tradition. To be forgotten was to be thinned into nothing. To have your name spoken was to remain present. To have your name written was to resist disappearance. So the Book of the Dead is not a book about dying. It is a book about staying whole. Now imagine the world the soul must cross. The Duat was not a single chamber. It was a landscape, rivers that gleamed like dark metal, corridors carved with spells, caverns where torchlight could not reach, gates guarded by beings who did not respond to pleading, only precision. Some gates demanded a title, some demanded a secret name. Some demanded the name of the gate itself, and the name of the doorkeeper, and the name of the bolt that slid shut. It sounds strange, until you understand the logic. If the universe has order, then the afterlife has order too, and order can be navigated. Many spells are written as first-person speech, because the deceased is meant to stand upright, face the unknown, and speak without trembling, not to beg, to state, to claim, to pass. In Egypt, words were not decoration, words were mechanisms, and the dead were expected to operate them. But operating a mechanism means knowing what it does. The Duat contains regions of darkness, regions of flame, and regions of water. There are islands and stairways. There are fields where spirits work, and canals that reflect starlight like polished obsidian. And each night, even the sun must travel through it. The Egyptians believed the sun god crossed the underworld after sunset, moving through 12 hours of night, confronting chaos so dawn could return. That nightly voyage made the Duat real, not metaphor, because if even the sun must pass through it, then so must the soul. So the Book of the Dead often does two things at once. It teaches you how to travel, and it teaches you how to endure the forces that want travel to fail. Chaos is not always a monster with teeth. Sometimes chaos is confusion. Sometimes it is forgetting. Sometimes it is the moment your voice fails and the gate remains closed. That is why the spells sound so certain. They are built to prevent hesitation. And some of those words are not poetic at all. They are practical. Statements of identity, lists of names, instructions for passage. But the most famous passages are the ones that lead toward a single test. Because the greatest gate in the Duat is not a door of stone. It is judgment. Before the soul faced the Duat, the living performed acts meant to keep a person intact. The body was washed and anointed with oils. Linen was wrapped in careful layers, each turn of cloth a quiet insistence. You will not fall apart. Amulets were placed like punctuation marks across the chest and throat, a scarab at the heart, a knot-shaped charm for protection, a pillar amulet to represent stability, small symbols that carried enormous weight because symbols were a language the universe understood. And then came a ceremony that sounds almost unbelievable, a ritual performed so the dead could breathe, speak, eat, and see in the next world. Tools were touched to the lips, stones or blades or instruments shaped for sacred use, while prayers were spoken in the still air. It was not meant to resurrect a corpse. It was meant to restore function to the soul. Because in the Duat, silence is danger. If you cannot speak, you cannot declare your name. If you cannot speak, you cannot answer a gate. If you cannot speak, you cannot defend your own heart. And in Egyptian thought, the heart was more than flesh. It was memory, intention, the private record of what you truly were. That created a terrifying possibility. What if your own heart spoke against you? So some burials placed a scarab amulet over the heart, inscribed with words that asked the heart to remain still, to not testify wrongly, to not turn into an enemy at the final hour. It is one of the most intimate moments in the entire tradition, a person asking their own inner self for mercy, not "make me perfect," but "do not betray me," because the final court would not be fooled by titles or gold, only by truth. And truth in Egypt had a name. Ma'at was not only a goddess, Ma'at was a principle, the idea that the cosmos itself depends on balance, order over chaos, right measure over excess, truth over distortion. To live with Ma'at was to keep the world from tipping. To break Ma'at was to invite disorder to spread like a storm. So when the Book of the Dead speaks of judgment, it is not describing a personal opinion. It is describing the universe correcting itself. And now, the journey reaches the scene ancient artists painted again and again, a great hall, a court beyond mortal law. The air is still, not because nothing moves, but because everything is watching. The dead arrive as a traveler, not as a ghost. They are led forward to the balance scale at the center of the space. Near the scale stands a jackal-headed guardian figure in traditional art, Anubis, guide of souls, master of the threshold. He does not threaten, he measures. He keeps the ritual exact. Beside him is a scribe, Thoth, keeper of records. His presence means one thing: whatever happens here becomes permanent. And beyond them, enthroned in stillness, is Osiris, Lord of the Dead in many traditions, associated with renewal, judgment, and the continuing life beyond the tomb. In paintings, these figures are not random characters. They are roles in a system: guide, measurer, recorder, judge. And at the center, waiting with calm certainty, is the scale itself. On one tray, the feather of Ma'at, light as breath and sharp as law. On the other, the heart, not simply an organ, but the total weight of a life. Here, no argument matters, no lineage matters, no crown matters, only the heart, because the heart is evidence that cannot be bribed. The deceased stands before the tribunal and declares not what they have done, but what they have refused to do. A moral inventory spoken in the first person: I have not stolen, I have not murdered, I have not caused suffering for pleasure, I have not cheated the scales, I have not turned away the hungry. The power of the confession is not that it sounds perfect. The power is that it sounds measurable. It treats ethics like weight, like balance, like something that can be tested. And then the scale begins to move. Anubis steadies the beam. Thoth watches, ready to record. The feather rests with impossible lightness, each barb catching torch glow as if it were made of dawn. The heart, often shown as a red stone amulet in art, hangs on the opposite tray. The beam trembles, it searches for equilibrium, and for a moment the underworld becomes silent. If the heart is balanced, if it is light enough, then the path forward opens. The soul is declared true of voice, fit to continue. But if the heart is heavy, if it carries a weight that will not lift, then the consequence is not a lecture, it is a presence. Near the scale waits a being the Egyptians depicted as a composite, part lion, part crocodile, part hippo. A devourer that does not rage, it waits. Not as a horror monster for entertainment, but as a consequence made visible. Because Egyptian judgment was never only about punishment, it was about cosmic balance. To live against Ma'at was to tilt the universe toward disorder. And the universe, in these stories, does not ignore disorder, it corrects it. So the Book of the Dead does not promise that darkness will be impressed by excuses. It promises only this: live in a way that can be weighed, live in a way that can pass. If judgment succeeds, the afterlife does not become abstract. It becomes familiar, a perfected Egypt, fields and waterways, harvest and peace, often imagined as the field of reeds. Not endless clouds, not silent nothingness. A life continued without the cruelty of chance. And even now the idea unsettles people. Not because it is grotesque, but because it is practical. The Book of the Dead treats death like terrain. It does not say, do not be afraid. It says, here is what you do. And at the core of it all is a very human fear, the fear of being forgotten. In Egypt, remembrance was power. To have your name spoken was to remain present. To have your name written was to resist disappearance. So the Book of the Dead was more than ink. It was a defense against silence. So when you hear Book of the Dead, imagine it differently. Not a cursed volume, not a horror prop, but a scroll laid beside someone who was loved by people who refused to believe a life should simply vanish. A map made of spells, a passport made of names, a promise that the night has exits. If you know what to say when the gate opens and the darkness asks you who you are. Thank you for watching. Until next time, may your path be clear, your name unbroken, and your heart light enough to pass.